Welcome to Disaffected. I'm Joshua Slocum, and this is the show where we talk about politics, culture, and relationships through a psychological lens. And I want to start out with some listener mail this week. With the exception of the famous people referred to in here, all the names have been changed, so you can't know who these people are. This comes from Jeremy. Jeremy says, a good portion of my life has been spent in the far left social and political sphere. In high school, I decided to go vegan. I went to anti-war protests in D.C. I attended rallies for abortion rights, and I wrote several papers in English about anarcho-syndicalism. Noam Chomsky was my Jesus. Emma Goldman was my Saint Mary. The Facebook and Tumblr radical left circle jerk reinforced everything I was feeling about the world. It all changed in 2011 and 2012. The late summer of 2011, after grad school, I went on a cross-country road trip with a buddy of mine, and one of our stops was in Chicago. A woman, we'll call her Sarah, that I met on Tumblr, offered to let us crash at her house, which was cool because it allowed us to save money on a hotel room. She and I slept in her bed, and my buddy crashed on her couch in the other room. I woke up in the middle of the night to her performing oral sex on me. And as a 23-year-old dude, my thought was more or less, hell, might as well let her. Anyway, the next day she approached me about wanting to be in a relationship, to which I more or less told her, it's nothing personal, but I don't want to be in a relationship with anybody right now. She was hurt. She sobbed. Ugly, blubbering sobs. It was awkward, but we said goodbye and parted ways. In February of 2012, after I had started dating the woman who would later become my wife, Sarah told all of my friends that I raped her. She had one of my friends post her story on Tumblr because it gives more credence if the allegations appear to have been vetted by a third party. That's flying monkeyism, people. That's what that is right there. I was immediately doxxed. My home address was posted. My parents' address was posted. My work information was posted. I received death threat after death threat after death threat. And so did my parents. My father and I share the same name, and someone confused his work phone number at a major university with my work phone number. So he and his colleagues received death threats and harassing phone calls. My family were all rape apologists who deserved to be hung. Someone in my city printed out stacks of wanted posters with my picture on them and posted them on bulletin boards all over town. I'll spare you all of the intricate details, but all of my friends believed Sarah. And why wouldn't they? Believe all women was the mantra. I lost almost everyone in my life with the exception of my future wife, my family members, and the one or two friends I had who weren't suffocating with Tumblr wokeness. I was in a spiraling existential crisis that took the better part of a decade to escape from. God bless therapy. Jeremy, I'm sorry to hear that. And I find it very plausible, very believable. It's a problem with the conversation about, well, there's lots of problems with the conversation about rape. But one of them lately is the idea of believe all women. And even saying this, like right now as I'm saying this to you, I'm tempted to start caveating everything I say and inserting things like, of course it's terrible to be raped. Of course most women aren't lying. Those things are true. I know it's terrible to be raped because I've been raped. But you don't need to be raped to understand that. You don't. And while it's true that most rape claims, at least to my knowledge, are not false, there is a steady percentage that are. And those that are, most likely come from people with borderline personality disorder. This is typical borderline behavior. I don't think it's typical, I just regret it and don't want to face it behavior. Anybody can feel that way. Many people have had a one-night stand that they later thought better of or that they were ashamed of. I'm not saying you have to be ashamed. I'm just saying that's a thing that happens to people. Normal people, though, they don't accuse people of rape. when it didn't happen. They don't tell their friends they were raped when they weren't. They don't get their friends to put their alleged attacker's personal information on posters and all over social media like Tumblr. That's not what normal people do. That's what borderlines do. They are dangerous. Gentlemen, stay away from women with borderline personality disorder. They are the ones who are going to claim you raped them. They are the ones who are going to claim that you beat them. They are the ones who are going to claim that you are an abusive male monster. And women, I'm sorry that this is true, and I'm sorry that it undercuts the vast majority of legitimate claims of abuse, because the vast majority are legitimate. But it is true. And me saying this and me warning men this way is not misogyny. It's not believing you. It's a fact. Women with borderline personality disorder are extraordinarily dangerous to the reputation of men. Stay away from them. You could get in very, very big trouble. You will not fix her. She will fix your wagon, but good. Let's stay on this topic. It's one of my favorites, borderline. I have to give credit to a listener and somebody who follows me on Twitter who goes by the handle Hot and Haughty for this, because it's hysterical. She tweeted, "Who's down for a game of disaffected bingo? Tina, bring me a mask." Yes, you get me. You really get me. So, Hot and Haughty made us a disaffected bingo card. And I got to tell you, she's got me dead to rights. I am apparently a walking parody of myself. I am a stereotyped character who says the same things over and over again in a predictable way. These are all so good. I'm going to read the card to you, but you should look it up. You know, maybe one of the things we should do, actually, we'll have merch at some point. At some point, maybe we'll have this as merch. But maybe you should make yourself this bingo card, print it out, and get it laminated and use dry erase and actually just sit with it at the show and see if you get bingo. And if you do, take a picture and send it to me. So here are the categories. The unclean, Munchausen syndrome by proxy, Vermont, Mommy Dearest, histrionic, Madonna, borderline classes, cluster B, projecting, libtard voice, my producer Kevin, splitting, trans kids, spells, Odyssey. I do that, don't I? The Odyssey Network, which I should plug. Check us out on Odyssey, Odyssee. And the reason I spell it is because it's not spelled the normal way. But that's a free speech platform that will continue to carry our content even if we get slammed off YouTube. But that's very funny. Flying Monkeys, Gilding the Lily, Get Fucked, Predatory, Stepford Wives, Narcissist, Ginning Up, Candy Cottaging, My Mother, My Therapist, and Infantilization. I love this. Thank you so much. This is hysterical. But wait, there's more. Because the theme of this segment is borderlines. So I admit I seeded the pot on Twitter because I wanted to get some content for the show, and I got some. So I put up a thread recently that I titled Shit Borderlines Do. And I gave a couple of anecdotes of my own and then asked people to give me theirs. So this is, okay, it's amusing, right? And I'm poking fun at this, but there's a pedagogical intent here. There's a serious intent here. I do this. I tell you stories and anecdotes like this, and I try to share those anecdotes that other people have, because it is, in my view, the best way to help any of you really understand what these people are like and to help you detect them if you're not yet as familiar with it as somebody like I am. I can read to you from the DSM. I can read the 9 criteria for borderline personality disorder. but it's contextless and dry. It's things like unstable sense of self and identity, excessive inappropriate anger. I mean, we know what these things are, but they don't really bring it to life. Actual examples of how these things manifest in interpersonal relationships is a much better way to identify somebody who may have borderline or any cluster B personality disorder. So, shit borderlines say. This is one about my mother. Shit borderlines say, what did I ever do to deserve my grown children abandoning me? As my mother says. Well, she institutionalized her 2 older children as teens and dumped them in the state care system while the third one ran away at 16 so he would escape the same fate. She couldn't jail him too. That's one reason. Next one is shit borderlines do. About 25 years ago, my mother went on a tear, a complaining tear, that her high school best friend, Susan, wasn't speaking to her anymore. And what an awful person she was. And why would she abandon the friendship? Are you detecting the theme of abandonment here? Well, because my mother was having an affair with Susan's son. She was fucking her best friend's son. I told you I come from a trailer court. It's amazing. I really don't think my mother understood what she'd done. I don't think she understood what a boundary that was that she crossed. She was legitimately baffled and angry that her friend reacted this way. One more. More shit borderlines do. My mother hauled herself off of welfare for a few years and actually became a welfare caseworker herself. She proceeded to trash talk all of her clients for being lazy, slutty, and undeserving. And then she quit and went back on welfare. Oh, mother dear. So other people shared some of theirs as well. This one comes from Josie Hallis. Borderlines physically attack you when you arrive at a predetermined time to take your terminally ill father out for lunch. The borderline was not invited to lunch. Well, of course she attacked you, you horrible bitch. What did you expect? Kate tells us of her borderline. They throw a big birthday party for your boyfriend. 2 hours in, they get pissed because some people you didn't invite sit in your kitchen without saying hello. They start talking shit about them, start screaming at them to leave, turn off the music, tell everyone, 30 people, to get the fuck out. They see your bestie, your best friend, trying to take the cake that you'd made together with her. They realize the party is planning to continue elsewhere without you. So, fight bestie for the cake. Throw it on the floor so it splatters all over the walls. Punch best friend. And once people leave, realize the house keys are gone and call the police. Hayden says this. Borderline said her car broke down and so she'd be unable to come into work. Simultaneously posted a Snapchat story showing her car in a parking lot 400 meters from our building with a caption about how excited she was for a party that night. Oh. Next one. This is very interestingly named Aloysius Wilbury. His borderline almost destroyed my relationship with my sister because the latter had the temerity to take up painting, and the borderline felt this was, quote, erasing her identity, as she also liked to paint. This is so typical. You hear in all of these scenarios that I've described, well, obviously the emotional dysregulation, the disproportionate response to non-existent or very mild provocations, but you also see the weak ego, the lack of a sense of self, the lack of a stable core, the lack of a feeling that you are an interesting and unique person in your own right, and the need to try to live vicariously through someone else's pursuits. Very typical of borderline personality disorder. They will often adopt your clothes, your hairstyle, the way you walk, the way you speak, the way you smoke a cigarette, any of these things. And they'll do it very quickly, and they'll act like it's normal. They won't say anything about it. It's you know the movie Single White Female? That's what this is. That wasn't an exaggeration. I mean, yes, it's more extreme because most of them, thankfully, aren't murderous. Although borderlines can be murderous. But Single White Female was not an exaggeration. That is exactly what they're like. Even if they don't go all the way creepy like that, and some of them do. This happened with my mother and my sister. I think it's more common with mothers and daughters, borderline mothers and their daughters. My mother, my mother abused all of her children. But she didn't try to take my identity. I think I know she felt, in some ways inadequate compared to me. She was jealous of some of the things that I'd accomplished, some of the skills that I had that she didn't feel that she had. But with my sister, it was a different story. My sister is a very talented person artistically. And almost anything she touches, she's good at. She can draw beautifully in pencil or charcoal. She's a fiber artist. She does everything from carding her own wool, raw wool, spinning it, then weaving it, knitting it. She makes tufted felted sculptures they're like dioramas they look like the illustrations from classic Grimm's fairy tales. The pencil drawings come to life, the magical fairy houses, things like this. I mean, she makes them in 3 dimensions made of felted wool that she has carded and dyed and put into shape. She's quite extraordinary, my sister. My mother is more modestly talented. My sister is an artist. My mother is not. She's not without skill, but she's not on my sister's level. But everything that my sister took up, my mother took up. So when my sister began working directly with fiber, my mother took up fiber. She got a spinning wheel. And my sister would go over to the house and they'd spin together and drink coffee and all these things. And, my sister would pretend everything was normal. When my sister started actually weaving her own fabric, my mother went out and bought a really large loom that was more expensive than she probably could have afforded and set it up in her living room, piled up all of her fabric everywhere and started doing that. And then, but a few weeks or a few months later, it gets dropped, never gets talked about again. It goes on to something else. And she would often, you could tell the insecurity that was underneath this, because when she was sitting and doing whatever craft she was engaged in, whether it was crocheting or sewing or felting or whatever, she would complain. She'd complain about what she said other people thought about her. So there were these constant declamations of things like, I am an artist, God damn it. Quilting is an art. Crochet is an art. It's just things that women do that aren't called arts. And I've been told all my life that this is just silly women's work and da-da-da-da-da. I don't know who's telling her this because no one speaks to her. But, she would go on and on and on, and she'd actually get herself worked up. She'd get angry about these people who she claimed had held her back or talked her down or destroyed her confidence or didn't give her credit. I mean, I suppose some of these things could have happened, but I don't think most of them did. I think they lived in her head. I think they're creations and projections of her own very real fears. And yes, it's sad. It's sad to live that way. My mother is a ball of anxiety and deep, deep insecurity that cannot be soothed. Can't be soothed. It's endless. And it's very, very sad because most of these problems are of her own creation. But anyway, hope that was a good object lesson in some of the real life ways that borderline personality comes to life in living color in 3 dimensions. Come back after the break. For more conversation on the dark and disordered psychology that shapes today's cultural and political left, subscribe to our weekly audio podcast on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pandora, Google Podcasts, and virtually anywhere else you get your podcasts. Let's learn to recognize these dynamics and call them what they are. Subscribe to Disaffected to learn how to break the spell.
We now have a bonus for our supporters. You can help the Disaffected podcast grow and receive invitations for our off-air Zoom hangouts by becoming a supporting member on Patreon or Subscribestar. Patreon users, go to patreon.com/disaffected. Subscribestar users, you can find us at subscribestar.com/disaffected. Check out our webpage at disaffected.fm for the complete list of ways you can help support us, and thank you.
Welcome back. Have you subscribed to us on audio yet? If not, please do. We are on Pandora, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Podcasts, anywhere you get your podcasts. Take us along in the car, take us along for the ride, take us along while you're washing dishes. And also, do you want to join our Zoom chats where I'm there and other members of the show and we just have a casual, off-air, non-recorded chat? You can get that if you support the show. Any level you want, go to subscribestar.com/disaffected or patreon.com/disaffected. Thank you. So remember last week when we went through the video from The Economist magazine about the cost of black hair? Well, hair seems to be, just like trans is the biggest vehicle right now for reputationally laundering narcissism into something respectable. Hair seems to be the way that people are able to whine and complain about non-existent oppressions and still be taken seriously enough to get an 8-page spread in major publications. So let's take a look at cutting through the binary. A long-form feature article from CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. That's Canada's equivalent to the BBC in the UK and equivalent to the US's National Public Radio, NPR. So, of course, it's super woke. And I went through this and read it and pulled out the highlights so you don't have to. Look at the good I do. Cutting Through the Binary is the title. Photographer documents transgender and gender nonconforming people's experiences with haircuts. Quote. I'm sorry. Hair is key to affirming transgender and nonconforming people's identity, but they often have trouble accessing haircuts that help them look the way they feel. There's that accessing again. You're going to hear it everywhere. Now that I pointed it out several times, you're going to hear it everywhere. Accessing. Just trying to access a haircut. Okay. I'll try not to do the voice too much. Back to the article. My heart races as I reach for the door handle of the barbershop. I sit down in a waiting area filled with men who turn to look at me. I worry they think I don't belong here. It's been 7 years since a barber shop in Regina denied me service. And yet still I get nervous whenever I go for a haircut. I had asked to book an appointment for a hard part, a traditional barber style cut in which a line is shaved deep onto the scalp to create a semi-permanent part in the hair. The person who answered the phone read my voice as feminine, told me they only cut men's hair. The next day, I told the media, and I was going to file a human rights complaint, after which hundreds of people took to social media to attack my character, question my motives, and publicly humiliate, harass, and threaten me. Bitch, you humiliated yourself. You humiliated yourself. The melodrama. And you know what? This is briar patching. She loves it. She loves it. Gives her a thrill. She wants to be humiliated. Humiliated in scare quotes. Attacked. This is gold. Absolute gold. This is how you earn martyrdom in this community. She wanted this to happen and she made it happen. This is the author of this article, a non-binary person named Evie Ruddy. You know, I just read her name as feminine, and I bet if I heard her voice on the phone, I'd read it as feminine too. Here we go. In the days that followed, I was afraid to leave my house and turned down media requests over concerns for my safety and mental health. I've always regretted not saying more. Here we go, honey. Here we go. Here's a picture. Here's a picture of Evie. So there she sits in the middle of the Canadian prairie on a green Naugahyde and chrome barber's chair. Man-spreading, I might add, with her hair put up in a top knot. It looks like a woman in a barber chair, because it is. Here's the caption. Evie Ruddy took this self-portrait 7 years after they were denied service at a Regina barbershop because of their gender. So it's denied because of their gender. Quote, barbershop supporters had hijacked the debate in order to advance a spiteful men's rights agenda that framed cisgender men as victims of feminism gone too far. Didn't frame them, honey. That's what happened. Meanwhile, many trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming, and two-spirit people were navigating a heavily gendered hair industry that impedes us from accessing haircuts that help us look the way we feel. So I set out to talk to other trans and gender non-conforming folks who go to barbershops. Let's talk about one of them. A man, a they-them called Nilin Lore. Nilin? Makes me think of Nilla wafers. So this is how Nilin is described. Nilin Lore, parentheses, they-them. A 35-year-old living in Saskatoon, Treaty 6, feels safer frequenting one of the city's queer and trans-friendly barbershops than they do walking down the city's streets. Notice that there. The goddamn Treaty 6 after Saskatoon. This is the evolution of the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are living on colonized and stolen land that was taken from the indigenous people. Om Namaste. This is just linguistic masturbation for white women. Here's Nilin. I once got a haircut where when I sat in the chair, I ended up having to sit through a sermon where I was being told about God and about my soul and about my relationships with not only my queer partner, but being polyamorous and how being non-monogamous is a sinner's lifestyle. That never happened. That never happened. Anybody who is wont to give a disquisition to somebody about their sinful lifestyle is not going to sit there and cut that person's hair. That this didn't happen. It's not real. He made it up. But he says, so here I am, vulnerable, with a person with scissors to my head, as I had to sit there and be told that I was despicable and disgusting. Vulnerable. Vulnerable. Who is this vulnerable person? Take a look at Nilin. Take a look. This is a 35-year-old man carrying extra weight with a beard and a dipshit hairstyle in a 1960s lady's house dress with horizontal zigzag stripes and a clashing orange hem. And Dora on Bewitched wouldn't be caught dead in that. There's your vulnerable person. There's more. As soon as I came into High Noon, a barbershop in Saskatoon, I was already very, very, very nervous because I was in this dress. I had already had to walk a few blocks and I'd had a lot of people staring at me. Oh, quel dommage. A lot of people pointing. And I came in and that environment just entirely shifted almost immediately. I was just literally very welcoming, affirming, no judgments, no staring. And by the end of it, when I looked into the mirror, everything was tidied up. I felt really, really, really rockin' and gorgeous. Clean your mirror. Because it isn't telling you the truth. This isn't the CBC, you guys. I know how mean I am. I know. I'm super mean, super caustic. They have it coming. These people are parading themselves in front of the entire world in Canada's biggest major broadcaster in a spread that, if it were on paper, would have taken up 10 full 4-color magazine pages. Let's talk about... Here we go. Kevin, my producer, mark your bingo card, was trying to pronounce this name earlier, and I wish he could be on here so he could actually say it. Keukun Pete Bull, they, them, moved to Saskatoon, Treaty 6, from North Battleford, Saskatoon 2 years ago. The 26-year-old, who is two-spirit, fears being turned away by barbershops and instead goes to a salon to see a certain stylist who respects the fluidity of their gender identity. So let's hear from Keukun. I had a buzz cut for the first time in all my life, and it was really freeing. I had the moment of, yeah, I don't have to deal with all that feminizing hair. I know not just women have long hair. I do have young men in my life that have long hair. But for me personally, being two-spirited, it was a difficult challenge of not being who I am and not feeling comfortable in my own skin. My friend's wife does haircuts and hairstyling, and they, the couple, this is what you guys need to see this. Because they won't stop using the they pronouns, the editor had to insert orthographic marks, brackets, to put the couple in there so that we knew that they was referring to the couple and not to Keukun. My friend's wife does haircuts and hairstyling, and they, the couple, have members in their family that are also part of the LGBT community, so I knew I felt safe around them. She also worked with me to make my hair both feminine, but yet still masculine enough for me that I can switch it however I want during the day, because I do dress more feminine sometimes, and I do dress more masculine sometimes, so having her confirm that in my hair made me feel even better. It's like new shimmer. It's a floor wax and a dessert topping. Let's take a look at Keukun. Pretty. It's just a woman, isn't it? It's just a woman with a bouffant. No, not a bouffant. It's more like a modified Help me, you guys. What's the word I'm looking for? Pompadour. That's it. It's just a woman with a pompadour. Well, how many more do we have here? Let me introduce you to Aspen. Does she have a brother named Valari? I'm sorry, excuse me, a sibling. Aspen Huggins, they, them, from Regina, Treaty 4, enjoys the control they have by cutting their own hair at home. No, honey, I think they enjoy the control they have doing this shit. Not to mention saving money while doing so. Quote, I've been cutting my own hair for about 2 years, and I started partly because when I would ask my stylist for changes, they kept adding little feminine details that I didn't ask for, and I didn't really know how to articulate what I wanted differently. How about you just ask for it, bitch? Just tell them to stop doing what they're doing and do something else. I mean, I just got my hair cut this week. She said, what do you want? I said, do a fade. Well, do you want a number 4 or number 2? I'd like a number 2 guard on the sides, please. Do you see how easy this is? I didn't know how to articulate it. Bullshit. Again, you just made this up for melodrama. Take a look at Aspen. Mid-20s, late 20s woman, lying on her bed, on her stomach, propped up on her elbows, kind of like I'm doing in front of the camera right here, with a bleach blonde wave in the front of her hair. And I'm not going to make fun of her for that because you all saw me at 16 years old on the show last week. And I had that bleach blonde penis-shaped mushroom hairdo. I mean, you know, it's just... She doesn't look any different from kids I went to college with. She doesn't look any different than I did. No, but... No. Nobody in any great number who works at a barbershop or hair salon is acting this way toward people. Nobody. Sure, there's a few of them out there. Sure, there are some barbershops that are run by crusty old men who only want to cut hair for other crusty old men. So let them. If you don't like how you're treated, if your directions aren't followed, that's not good customer service. I wouldn't want to pay for it either. Go somewhere else. Human rights violation. For Pete's sake. Here's how Evie closes out the article. Quote, nowadays, I regularly get my hair cut at barbershops. I sit in the waiting area, often surrounded by cisgender men. When it's my turn, the barber shaves the sides and back of my head, rubs shaving cream onto my scalp, and cuts a hard part into my hair with a straight razor. When he's finished, I see my gender identity reflected in the mirror. I leave feeling happy and dapper. Again, I'm going to tell you what I told Nilin. Wash your mirror. Because you're not seeing a gender identity in the mirror, you're just seeing a reflection of yourself. That's all you see. Everywhere you look is a reflection of you. Because this is about narcissism. This is not about human rights. It's not about sexist treatment. No, I'm sorry, I can't even say sexist anymore because you don't have a sex, do you? 8 to 10 pages of this bullshit. Proudly featured by the CBC. They tweeted it. They're proud of this. Happy and dapper. I see my gender identity reflected in the mirror. Maybe she does see it in there. Because that's all it is. Gender identity. It's an image. It's an illusion. It's a visual and linguistic artifice. It's a bit of presentation. It's stagecraft. It's theater. A lot of us want a little theater in our lives. I like a little theater in my life. I get a little theater on this show every week. I have a performative streak. It's obvious to everyone who watches or listens. I like it. I have fun. Most of you have fun too, which makes it fun for me. There are healthy ways to do this. These are not healthy ways. These are not healthy people. My guess, people say this a lot. They say, they're not crazy, they're not mentally ill, they're just full of themselves. It's a misreading. People like this, in my view, have something in the neighborhood of borderline/narcissistic/histrionic personality disorder, or at least a very, very large portion of traits. Yes, this is narcissistic. It is attention-seeking. But if my surmise about their frame of mind, their state of mind is correct, then they very likely have been abused and neglected. It's very likely that most of these people do come from inadequate parenting. They may have been gaslit. They may have had their needs ignored. They may have learned that the only way to get their needs met was to scream and scream and scream until nobody could ignore them. I understand this. I grew up there. I lived it. But that trauma that that destabilizes a person this way, it doesn't actually continue once you leave there. I mean, you can bring it back into your life with other people, but it doesn't continue unless you make it continue. And a lot of us do. I did for a long time. And I'm awfully glad that those earlier parts of my life weren't documented on social media the way it is for these people. Because I fear that some of them who have the capacity to, and probably will improve over time, might feel painted into a corner by this. They might think they've invested so much into this image that they don't want to get rid of it. And I think that would be a terrible and unfortunate trap. And I'll close this segment up with how Evie described they-self in their writer's bio. Evie Ruddy, they, them, is a digital storyteller, PhD student in cultural mediations at Carleton University and PhD fellow with the Transgender Media Lab. They live in Treaty 4 in the city colonially called Regina with their two pups, Frankie Latigra and Gracie Peaches. Jesus Christ, go to commercial. Kevin, go to commercial. See you guys on the other side. For more conversation on the dark and disordered psychology that shapes today's cultural and political left, subscribe to our weekly audio podcast on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pandora, Google Podcasts, and virtually anywhere else you get your podcasts. Let's learn to recognize these dynamics and call them what they are. Subscribe to Disaffected to learn how to break the spell.
We now have a bonus for our supporters. You can help the Disaffected podcast grow and receive invitations for our off-air Zoom hangouts by becoming a supporting member on Patreon or Subscribestar. Patreon users, go to patreon.com/disaffected. Subscribestar users, you can find us at subscribestar.com/disaffected. Check out our webpage at disaffected.fm for the complete list of ways you can help support us, and thank you.
Welcome back. I want to spend this last segment talking about why I believe that one of the most important things you can do to make progress in getting past childhood trauma, abuse, the bad habits, the bad mental hygiene that a person accrues from experiencing child abuse and domestic abuse. For me, it has to do, the biggest piece of it, I think, for me, was understanding cluster B. So what I'm going to argue here is that knowledge itself, not even necessarily focused self-soothing work or cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. I'm not talking them down. I'm not saying you shouldn't do them, but I'm not talking about those. What I'm saying is actual factual knowledge and understanding all by itself with nothing else I think, did the most to help me make progress and and I'm sorry, I don't like the touchy-feely language either. It makes me feel skeevy too, but I don't know another word for it. But I think knowledge itself was the thing that contributed most to my healing, to the degree that I have been able to integrate and bring my emotions under control and stop being afraid of things I don't need to be afraid of and pay better attention to things that are actual danger signals, came from understanding cluster B and understanding my mother. Just knowledge. So I talked about that a little bit this week on social media. And a couple of people pushed back on it. One of them was a fairly well-known popular psychologist who responded. I made a comment to the effect of what I just said. And she responded, I think her point, I don't think we necessarily disagree. We just don't know each other very well. And we only had a couple of comments, at each other. It wasn't really a long discussion. Her advice was stop trying to understand your borderline or your narcissist because they don't make sense. And if you try to make them make sense, you'll waste your own time and you'll constantly be second guessing yourself and thinking that if you just did something the right way, then everything would be fine. And there's a lot of truth to that. You will waste a lot of time thinking if you could just find the right words, the right tone of voice, if you could just find the right time to talk through a problem, then everything would be okay. If you've got a cluster B, that isn't going to work. She's absolutely right. But I mean something a little bit different. I mean, it isn't true that their behavior doesn't make sense. It's true in a sense, but in another sense, it's not. So yeah, it's true that somebody who pitches a fit, like the story that one of my Twitter pals that I read to you earlier, borderline mom who didn't like the fact that she wasn't the queen of the party, tried to grab the cake and then threatened to call the police on everybody. That is senseless, irrational behavior. In the context of a normal mind. That's key. That context isn't there for the borderline, the narcissist, the histrionic. But it does make sense if you understand what the cluster B mind is. You will never make sense of it by comparing your father's behavior, your husband's behavior, your mother's behavior to that of what a normal person would do in a normal situation. You won't make sense of it that way. It's like that concept of the reasonable person test. We often see this cited in law. It sometimes comes up in court cases where there's we have to make a judgment call about whether somebody's actions were justifiable, and we use what we call the reasonable person test. What would a reasonable person of ordinary intelligence have likely done in this situation? And it's a good rule of thumb, but it breaks down with cluster Bs because cluster Bs are by definition unreasonable people, constitutionally unreasonable people. But it isn't senseless. When you understand that the narcissist, for all that you would describe him as egotistical, actually has no stable ego, no firm ego structure, that he's terrified, that he is inadequate, that he feels inadequate, that he has nothing that stays the same from day to day that he can rely on when other people aren't there to bolster it for him, then you understand what motivates him. He's terrified that he isn't real. Because in a sense, he's not fully real. When you understand that the borderline's major fear is abandonment and a kind of dissolution, the idea that if you don't have the trappings, if you don't have your hobbies, if you don't have your makeup, if you don't have your friendship circle, all the props, right? The props that set the stage for your life. That if you don't have those, that you'll disappear. That you're not really real. That is it's a terrible fear. It's a terrible fear. That's what motivates these people. And so when they act out the way they do, when they grab the cake, when they threaten to call the cops on everybody at the birthday party, when they do these senseless things, there's a sense to be made of them when you understand why they're doing it. They're not actually reacting to the people in the room. Those people that they're calling the police on, they're not actually reacting to them or anything that they actually did. They're reacting to a fear and a fantasy that lives only in their mind. They want to be in control. And if they can't be in control, they're going to engineer a way to be in control because they feel out of control inside. Cluster B makes sense within its own framework. This is why I do this show. This is why I spend so much time on this one particular way of being mad. Because it's a way of being mad that is in vogue right now. We're seeing it everywhere. It's becoming mainstream. And even though the majority of people that we deal with every day are not cluster Bs, I would guess that up 6 to 9 or 10% of them are. And that's enough. They certainly are in control of the cultural levers of power. Understand their motivations. Get inside their minds. It does make sense within its own framework, not within the framework of the reasonable person. I needed... Well, let me back up. Let me tell you a story about disassociation. I'm not an expert in this. There are people who know a lot more about the particular manifestations of disassociation than I do, but I know more than the average person. There's a lot of talk about it because, of course, one of the new vogues is something called dissociative identity disorder, which is just a rebranding of what we used to call multiple personality disorder, which was a rebranding of what we called before that split personality. Right? This is what became popularized in the late 50s and early 60s by the movie The Three Faces of Eve, and then even more highly popularized in the late 70s and early 80s with the publication of the book and then the television movie Sybil, about a woman who allegedly had dozens of different autonomous personalities living inside her head. Her mind had fractured because of severe child abuse. And so she developed all of these personalities as a defense mechanism that were their own separate people that weren't even aware of each other. That isn't real. Disassociation is real. You can become disconnected from reality. You can have symptoms from that. But these autonomous personalities, these whole people, these whole conscious entities living inside one brain, that isn't real. When I was between 10 and 12 years old, as I've told you before, that was the time in my childhood home where my mother's abuse became as florid as it was ever going to become. That was when the screaming, the constant screaming, the night raids, the pulling me out of bed at midnight, making me rewash dishes, rewash the floor, reorganize, refold my clothes. That was when all of that was at a fever pitch. In my household, and this is true in households headed by somebody with borderline personality disorder, and to some degree narcissistic. I mean, my mother is both a borderline and a narcissist. But things don't make sense. Logic and even the concept of cause and effect are absent. I often wonder if people haven't experienced this, if it's possible to imagine it. Maybe it is. I hope it is. But if you can, think about how dementing it is to a mind to live in a world where cause and effect don't exist, where everything that happens is arbitrary. Moods are arbitrary. being slapped comes out of the blue, where you can be apparently loved and praised as a wonderful, beautiful, smart child, and then 2 hours later or the next day, this same mother hates your guts, calls you a bastard, calls you dirty, says you're just like every other piece of shit man she's ever known, and she knows exactly what you're going to grow up to be. How do you reconcile the loving mother who sings you a lullaby one night and then calls you a deadbeat son of a bitch the next day? You can't reconcile this as a child. You have to escape it somehow. And the way I escaped was through dissociating. During that period from 10 to 12, this was, I can see where a lot of my psychiatric problems started. They started in, they started when I was born. Naturally. But I can really see the roots clearly in this time period. This was the development of what became a formal diagnosis of obsessive compulsive disorder, Tourette's-like tics, eventually panic disorder. I became convinced that I wasn't really living on Earth in the same plane that everybody else was. I thought that I was a boy out of time. So there were two books. One was a series of books. One was another one that I obsessed about. And I came to believe that those books were actually talking about me. Yeah, it actually does sound a little bit schizoaffective. I don't think it really went all the way there, but it does sound that way. One of them was a series of books. I think there were about 8 of them. I'm not going to say the name of these books because honestly, I'm still a little afraid of looking at them again. I haven't looked at them again since I was that age. I haven't even looked them up online. So I'm not going to tell you what they are because I don't want to make it real again for me. Not that I'd lose my mind in them, but it's a little bit tender. This series of books had as its main character a boy who lived in late 19th century America. And he and his brother would get up to all sorts of misadventures. They would break into old abandoned houses that were reputed to be haunted, and they'd figure out the secret there, sort of Nancy Drew Hardy Boys kind of thing. But the kid was some kind of kid genius, and he could always figure out how to get into a place that nobody else could figure out. He would do things like steal the skeleton keys that used to have to lock doors in Victorian houses. Well, he'd steal that from his father's study, and he'd take a bar of soap and press the key into it and make an impression, and then he would carve a wood copy and then let himself into the part of the house that he wasn't supposed to. I thought this was tremendous. I just loved this. But I became convinced that I was this kid and that I had been plucked out of that timeline and put into the 20th century, and that somehow I'd been left here, I'd been lost here, and I needed to get back there. And I spent most of my waking hours in this fantasy. I thought that people around me weren't quite real, like I had my foot in another physical dimension. And that if I turned the corner the right way, or if I stood in the right position, if I turned the right way, maybe I could find the passage. I'm not speaking metaphorically. I literally believed these things. It was more than just an imaginative fantasy. And when I came to the end of the series of that book, that series of books, when I read them all, I was just intensely depressed because it was over. The stories were over, and in some sense, my delusion was over too. But I developed another one, and I read another book that really moved me emotionally, and it was about again, I've always had a fixation with the 19th century. I don't know why. But this was set in the 19th century as well, and it was about a Native American boy. And I believed that I was this boy reincarnated, that I was a Plains Indian. And again, I was out of time. I never told anybody about these fantasies. This is the first time I've ever spoken about it. I've told my therapist about it, but I haven't even talked about it with my sister or my best friends. So I was caught up in these fantasies. I was disassociated. I was escaping the house that I lived in my imagination. And I guess it didn't do me any harm. I came out of it, obviously. But I got to tell you, I had made it so real to myself that I was profoundly depressed when the delusion wore off. I mean, achingly depressed. I was despondent. I was absolutely despondent. Because I was back in the real world that didn't make any sense. And, you know, it wasn't long after that the problems between my mother and I became even worse. And that's when I began attempting to commit suicide. And that's what eventually got me made a ward of the state and taken out of my home. But this was what I could do, I think, as a child, with the experience that I had. This was how I could escape. This is how I could make the world make some sort of narrative sense. And I need narrative sense. I don't do well with ambiguity. And I might have something to learn about ambiguity. I know a lot of people would tell me, find a way to be more comfortable with ambiguity. Maybe, but I don't want to. Because I think that most things can be understood if you understand their internal framework. And so today, instead of retreating into delusion or retreating into alcoholism, as I did, or other self-destructive behaviors, I have concentrated on making sense of my childhood and making sense of my mother and figuring out my mother's psychology. And another person who pushed back on me when I talked about this said, no, don't try to figure them out. You figure out yourself. I understand what they mean. But I don't think I could have come here by any different path than I did. I don't know if it's the same for other people. I'd be interested to know what it's like for you. Many of you have been through similar experiences to me. Leave a comment, talk about it on the YouTube channel. Tell me what it was like for you, because I'd like to know. But for me, I needed to make narrative sense, and I could not understand myself until I understood my mother. And I understand my mother now. I began understanding her 5, almost 6 years ago. And Cluster B did it. I understand that my mother is a borderline. She's a narcissist. She's very damaged, and I know the ways that she's damaged. Her senseless behavior, her violence, her lying, her unstable emotions, they didn't make any sense in the rational world, but I know what they are now. I know where they come from. And it helped me to understand myself. Why I developed the reactions that I did. How I inherited and displayed some of those traits of borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder. It has not led me to forgive my mother in any uncomplicated way. And I'm going to do a show about forgiveness, hopefully sometime soon. I maybe talk to some people about it because it's interesting. I'm not quite sure what it is. And everybody has a slightly different definition. But I don't forgive. I'm no longer ragingly angry. I don't have nightmares anymore. I don't startle when I see a car like the one my mother drove. All of these things happen to me. That's all gone now. I still think about it a lot, obviously. I couldn't not, right? I mean, I've built a show on my experiences. But I am far more at peace with this understanding and with this narrative structure. And maybe this is my religious impulse. I don't know. Humans they need narrative. They need to tell stories. I think I'm doing what humans do. I hope I'm telling an accurate story to myself and to you. But that's what I have to say about that. Don't underestimate what knowledge can do for you when you uncover the real root and when you understand things on their own terms, even deranged and frightening things. If you're like me, that will be 75 to 80% of the healing that you actually need. Because you know why? That's what finally convinces you that you're not crazy. Have a good week. I'll see you next week.